and welcome to The Art of Being Human. I'm going to start off just by making some general comments about addiction and why people do it and what the psychological factors are involved. Because when people behave in a certain way, it's because they expect an end to what it is that they're doing. In other words, an expected end. And sometimes they don't know what kind of an end it's going to be, but people do behavior because of expectations that they have. And the reason it's so difficult for them to stop is they're continually searching for those expectations to be fulfilled, whatever they are. So I just want to make some general comments about psychological factors at first. Why do people drink alcohol? Why do people use drugs? Although this is focused more on alcohol, I think it has to do with anyone who's doing any kind of an addiction at all. Well, alcohol or any other drug is used a lot of times to self-medicate and to stop anxiety. Now, there are better ways of stopping anxiety. The longer method, but also the more successful method, is to find out why you're anxious to begin with. I had one of my students, he was a really nice person, and I really liked him, and he was scared to death every day. He had some kind of an anxiety disorder, and he was always fraught with nervousness. I feel nervous today. Well, how come do you feel nervous today? I'd talk to him about it, and he'd say, I'm always nervous. There's never a day that goes by that I'm not nervous. And I had a college professor who was on the other extreme. He says, I've never been nervous a day in my life. I'm always just comfortable. I'm always doing what I want to do. And no matter if there's a crisis that comes, I just deal with it and be on my way. I'm just never nervous. And so I think part of that, of course, is genetic, because I think that we behave according to what our genetics are. So anyway, alcohol can be used and other drugs to be used to self-medicate. Why would you self-medicate? And that would be to stop anxiety. You know, it's worth going back and finding out in your life what causes you to be so anxious. Some people are just more anxious than others. That's just a part of their personality. But some people have reasons to be anxious. I was talking with a gal, a friend of mine. I wasn't counseling her. We were both college students at the time, but we figured out what was wrong with something that was happening to her. She had this weird thing where she could go up the steps, but she couldn't go down. And most of our classes in psychology were located on the top floor of a building, and she had to go up the steps to get there. I don't think there was an elevator. This is quite a few years ago. And she went up the stairs fine. But I says, when we went to go downstairs after the classes were over, she'd stand and she'd be frightened. And the only way she could get downstairs would be to sit down and scooch and go step by step by step down on a sitting position, which looked rather odd. So we talked about that, and at the time I was a freshman, she was a freshman, so we didn't have a lot of psychological knowledge, but it turned out she told me about a situation that happened to her when she was very young. When she was just a child, probably not even in school, her father was a pilot. And he would fly over the house where they were and tip his wing in acknowledgement of her, because she would watch him fly from the ground. He was in the service or something, and he would fly around. He'd tip his wing. That was like saying hello to her. Well, one day, he was in an accident. He tipped his wing. Something went wrong with the plane, and he crashed, and he died. He died in an airplane crash while he was circling around their house. Well, if you stop to think of what a child would think, you know, air, height, and that would be transferred into the symbolism of the steps go high. Now, this would be all an unconscious thing that was going on with her, but we made it conscious, and I think eventually she was able to stop the behavior. But when she thought of being high and looking down, it's as if she was with her father in an airplane, and she was up at a higher level looking down, and then there was going to be a crash because her father died in the crash. Now, a young child can't explain all of that, but what they do is they catch it in symbolic forms. And so therefore she kept thinking, as if she was a child, Daddy died. He died going down. He was in an airplane going down. I'm on the steps looking down. I might die. Something might happen to me. Now, this is child logic, but this is the way children think. You've got to remember that the human mind is not really mature until age 25 or thereabouts. So therefore, this child symbolism takes hold, and it has a life of its own. Once you get caught up in something like that, it's very hard to get rid of it, even if you know that this doesn't make sense. Now, in her case, she didn't understand the symbolism. She was acting out the symbolism without understanding where it came from. Once I talked to her about it, and this made sense to her, yes, her father died crashing and going down. She's afraid to go down. She's afraid to go down on steps, if they're high steps especially. And so there's a connection there. She's making a connection and behaving as if what she was thinking as a child was true. That was never challenged because she never faced it. So you'd be surprised, the people who have habits, the people who have anxieties, what do they want when they are anxious? They want freedom from their anxiety. You know, they may not know why they're anxious, but their first wish is to have freedom from it and then work out what the details are later. This college student, I think that was more genetic with him, that he was nervous all the time. He accepted that as part of his life, but he wasn't comfortable with it. And I think now with different types of therapies available today, he would have really been able to be helped by it. At that point, he was just struggling through it. He was a good student. I knew he would do very well, but he'd be uncomfortable because he wouldn't be able to shake the nerves. You know, a lot of people, when they are performers, they go out and they do solos, or they sing solos, they do whatever, public speaking, whatever it is. They get very, very, very anxious just before they go on stage. As soon as they go on stage, all of a sudden the fear dissipates and they're fine. So what's happening? They're suffering from anticipatory anxiety. They're afraid of what's going to happen in the future. They're afraid of what's going to happen when they go out on stage. They're afraid of what's going to happen when they actually meet the people that they're going to be speaking with if they're a public speaker. And then when they actually get into the situation, it's no longer anticipatory because they're there and they're doing it. A lot of people have anticipatory anxiety before they go to a doctor. They don't know what's going to happen at the doctor's, and so therefore they're afraid of it. When they get into the situation, it's not anticipatory, and as soon as you're in the situation, the anticipation is gone because you're right there, and then you start to relax. Now, knowing and understanding this is an important key in order to master it, in order to gain mastery over it. And so it's important that people understand where their anxiety comes from. But in today's world, what do they want? The quick fix. You know, what they really want is give me the pill, or if there's no pill for this and I can't get a pill for it, I'll drink. Or I'll use drugs. I feel better when I'm high anyway, so why not do it? The problem is you're going to have more and more to achieve that same level of comfort, and pretty soon your brain chemistry changes, and then when your brain chemistry changes, then the brain demands the drug or the cigarettes or the alcohol, whatever it is. So therefore you are no longer getting pleasure from it, you are using it so you don't get withdrawal symptoms, and then it now controls you. It is your master. So in terms of these psychological factors, it is used to help to curb anxiety, but I'm giving you this extra information. It also increases a sense of power and well-being and self-worth, even though that's temporary, because as soon as the drug wears off, all of those senses are gone, and you're back where you were to begin with. So what do? Take more drugs so that you don't have to go through the anxiety and the sense of powerlessness and all of that. In other words, do something to avoid facing the problem so you don't have to face the problem, when it's always better to face the problem. Now, there are personality factors that are involved. Some people have low self-esteem. Some people have depression. Some people have problems with antisocial behavior. And there are sociocultural factors. If a parent uses alcohol to medicate, the child's going to learn to do it too, because they're going to see what the parent does. It must be okay, my folks do it, and they're going to end up by doing the same thing as the parents do. Now, drugs can create positive feelings, and it's very tempting for people to rely upon that rather than to find out what's really going on in their lives, take control of it, and what do you know after that? Well, then you're hooked on something. Now, there are predisposing factors, and I've mentioned it before, but genetics is one of the predisposing factors. There is a heredity factor. Children of alcoholics are 3 times more likely to become alcoholic than children who do not have alcoholic parents. Identical twins are more likely than fraternal twins to become alcoholic. And I am a fraternal twin. Neither my sister or I drink at all, or use drugs for that matter. There are certain cultures that use more alcohol and drugs than other cultures, so it becomes a part of the culture. If something is a part of the culture, a child is going to grow up and think this is normal, this is all right, this is fine, everybody does it, it's a part of the culture. And this is where marijuana has headed, and my concern is that marijuana is not a safe drug. It has medical uses that are good, that it has a place, but when you use it for social activities, then you can get too much and you can have a psychotic episode with marijuana, just like you can other drugs. If you get too much of it, that's something people need to remember if they're using it recreationally. Now, what happens to the body when you have these drugs that you're taking? And I'm talking in general, I'm not talking about any specific drug here. Well, for one thing, it depresses the central nervous system. And in doing that, you do not really have full functioning of your nervous system. It will depress the central nervous system. You can go from feeling tranquil to feeling anxious, believe it or not, to sleep, to coma, and then to death. You know, you get too much of a drug, you feel high, then you're tired, then, believe it or not, you can be very anxious, then you can get psychotic reactions from the drugs, you can have hallucinations, you can have delusions, and finally to the point where you become kind of comatose, it's taken over, and after that, if intervention doesn't happen, then of course you can die. Now, one of my concerns about Narcan, the drug that does so well in taking people out of the furnace, if you want to discuss it that way, when they're overdosed on drugs. It does work with heroin very well, but from everything I read, it doesn't work very well for cocaine. And the other thing is, it gives people a false sense of security. I'm not saying don't use it. It's a miracle drug. It saved many people's lives. But people actually need to be reasonable about this. If you think you can just keep on using drugs and using drugs and using drugs because someone's always going to be there to drag you out of a bad situation if you've overdosed, well, you know, Narcan can only go so far. You might be at a party sometime taking too many drugs and there's no one around that has Narcan. You might get stuck in a situation where it's not available, or even if it is available, somebody doesn't know how to use it. And so, and it doesn't, you know, everybody can't use it. I mean, there's only so much. If you keep using it and you do it over and over and over again, then you're taking advantage of a system where you expect to be rescued. Well, what about everybody else that also needs to be rescued? You shouldn't use the fact that there is a drug to pull you out of a bad situation as an excuse to continue doing that bad situation. That's not very good. You can use that drug, or someone can use that drug with you and get you out of a bad situation, and your responsibility is to see how you can do something different, to see what's causing you to want to use a drug over and over again, just assuming somebody will save you. Because at some point, maybe they can't save you. Maybe they're not there. And so you end up in a coma and a hospital situation, possibly even dying from a drug overdose. So you need to remember that drugs do depress the central nervous system. They're addictive. They give physical dependency. They give psychological dependency. They give tolerance. That means you can tolerate more and more and more, and you must have more and more and more to achieve the same level of tranquility that you had before. So these are just some things to keep in mind. Now, the most common addiction, of course, is alcohol. That's the most common. 18.7 million people are dependent upon alcohol, and that's 7.7% of the population. Now, with all of the recreational drugs that are being used, I kind of question this, but I still think that alcohol is the most common drug addiction. It is a drug. And according to what I've read, 12,000 more people use it daily for the first time. So I can't guarantee and vouch that all of these figures are accurate. But what they can do is give you kind of a ballpark figure as to what's going on. AA has about 2 million members. That's Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's a small percent of those who need it. If you consider that 7% of the population are dependent on alcohol, they're addicted to alcohol, only 2% show up at AA meetings. Now, AA is a terrific organization that really helps. I've counseled people who are alcoholics, and some of them have to go to meetings every day. As long as they're going to those meetings and they stay with it, then they can stay away from the alcohol. Otherwise, they have a problem. If they're not at the meetings, or they skip the meetings, or it's not important, I don't need it anymore, they could gradually slip back into alcohol use. Now, tobacco has 71.5 million users, and that's 23.4% for men, 18.5% of women who are addicted to tobacco. And 44% of these people are between 18 and 25 that use tobacco. Now, a lot of people smoke, and I have to mention something about the e-cigarettes. The e-cigarettes were originally used to help people stop smoking and not to have the nicotine get into the air. Now it's become something else. It's a recreational drug on its own, because even though you might be not getting the nicotine in the air, what's happening is with the flavored nicotines and all of that students like to use, they can be just as addictive as any other cigarette. The only advantage in terms of society is you're not puffing and blowing the particulate matter from nicotine in the air, but you're still getting it in your system, and you can get addicted on that. And then I've never even used, because I don't smoke anyway, but I never have seen an e-cigarette, but I guess they come in flavors. You can get different flavors, and so the kids like them for that reason, but it's not good for you, and it causes cancer just as much as a regular cigarette does. So if you're going to stop smoking, use e-cigarettes, if you must, as a temporary measure to get you off cigarettes, because cigarettes are dangerous and they cause cancer and other illnesses. So you need to remember that. They are used by smokers as substitutes. No nicotine goes into the air, but smokers are getting poisoned by the liquid nicotine that's used in these cigarettes, even though it's not released into the atmosphere. So they're really not good for you. Now, caffeine. Almost everybody uses caffeine. 80 to 90% use caffeine from coffee and soda. And, you can get too much of caffeine, too. I was in a store, and I looked at one of these energy drinks. Now, I'm in my 80s, so I looked at the energy drink, and I thought, well, it's just caffeine, and it's just vitamin B with the caffeine. So maybe I should just try it and see. I mean, it's certainly not like a regular drug. And I wasn't going to buy it, but I thought about it. And it turned out I didn't buy it, and I've never had one, and I'm glad of that, because a man came up to me, in the store. I didn't know who he was. And he said, don't buy it. And I wasn't going to buy it anyway. I'd made the decision not to. He says, that will get your heart ramping so fast, it'll be very dangerous for you. Now, I have heart trouble, so I took him seriously, and I never got it. But caffeine can really ramp you up and can do damage to you as well. So, for caffeine, 1 cup of coffee has about 100 milligrams of caffeine, unless you do the decaf, and it can lead to physical dependence. And if you don't get your caffeine as you want to, then you will have, or you can have, withdrawal symptoms. Now, this isn't anything like heroin or cocaine or any of the harder drugs, but it is kind of a drug, and people do depend on it in order to get themselves revved up. Students take NoDoz, which I guess is still selling it. It's a pill, but it's loaded with caffeine so they can stay awake all night and study. It's really not good for the system, but everybody uses it. In fact, I don't know as you can get a soda that's completely 100% caffeine-free. And to decaf, like decaf coffee, they use hydrochloride. Maybe they use something else now, too, to get the caffeine out. But they can't get it out 100%. There's still at least 3% caffeine in whatever you're drinking. Now, 3.6 million are drug dependent. And most of these are men. Some of them are women. And marijuana and cocaine and pain pills are most often used in the drugs. Alcohol most often used overall. And at this point, probably 700,000 people are being treated for some kind of an addiction. Addiction is something you can lick, and you're better off without it. But I understand that under the stresses of society, people do turn to drugs. It would be better for them to turn to something else. Find out about yourself. Join a church. Do something that's productive for you, and find out who you are, and find out what you are all about, rather than masking everything with a substance. You'll be healthier that way. Now, I'm going to close it here. We'll be continuing with this next time. Please join me then.